This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Good evening. My name is Jacinta Thompson and I'm the Executive Director and Events and Exhibitions Producer of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land we meet on today is Kaurna land. We wish to express our respect for the Kaurna people, their elders and ancestors, and acknowledge the spiritual and cultural relationship the Kaurna people have with their traditional land. So, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here on behalf of the Hawke Centre and the conversation to our event, and I feel like I want to do this. How did we end up here? The conversation's experts on 2021 and what happens next. I would like to congratulate the conversation team on their recent publication, No, You're Not Entitled to Your Opinion, and 49 other essays that got the world talking. And of course, our fine panellists who are joining us tonight, who have contributed to the conversation online for many years. The session tonight is being recorded and a video of the event will be on the Hawke Centre website next week. We encourage you to bring this to the attention of your friends and colleagues who could not join us tonight. As we are filming, can you please switch your phones to silent so that we don't have any interruptions? And it is now my great pleasure to welcome Walkley Award-winning journalist Jane Howard, Deputy Section Editor, Arts and Culture at The Conversation, who will introduce our panel and facilitate tonight's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone so much for coming. Like Jacinta said, I'm the Deputy Arts and Culture Editor at The Conversation, and I'm really delighted to be here today. I also want to pay my respects to the Kaurna people whose land we gather on today. This Tananyanga has been a gathering place for ideas and for storytelling for millennia, and it's really beautiful to be able to continue that tradition. I'm going to introduce a wonderful panel of experts. I'm going to read their full bios because they're very impressive and I want all of the sort of details to be out there. So Dr. Alice Gorman is an internationally recognised leader in the field of space archaeology and author of the award-winning book, Dr. Space Junk versus the Universe, Archaeology and the Future. Her research focuses on the archaeology and heritage of space exploration, including space junk, planetary landing sites, off-Earth mining and space habitats. She is an associate professor at Flinders University and a heritage consultant with over 25 years' experience working with Indigenous communities in Australia. In collaboration with NASA and Chapman University, she's part of a team conducting the first archaeological study of the International Space Station. Alice is also Vice Chair of the Global Expert Group on Sustainable Lunar Activities and member of the Advisory Council of the Space Industry Association of Australia. In 2021, asteroid 551014 Gorman was named after her in recognition of her work in establishing space archaeology as a field. So, probably the only person in the room with an asteroid named after them.
Is there anyone else who's got an asteroid named after them? I tell you, it was the thrill of my entire life to have this little asteroid.
Do you ever look up and see it? Is that something you can do? Or?
You can't see it. You need some pretty fancy telescope work to see it. But I kind of feel like conscious of it. I kind of feel connected to it in some kind of way.
Beautiful.
It's not going to hit us.
I think probably not. That's the best I can say at the moment.
Adrian Esterman is the Chair of Biostatistics and Epidemiology at the University of South Australia, a position he has held for the last 16 years. His career includes 5 years as a World Health Organization staff member based in Geneva and 2 years as a staff member in the WHO European office in Copenhagen. His current research covers a diverse range of medical and health areas, including infectious disease, gerontology, is that correct? Great. Refugee settlement, diabetes, cancer epidemiology, Indigenous health, mental health, dentistry and nursing. He has nearly 400 publications, many in high-impact journals with over 16,000 citations. He is currently a chief investigator on 8 major grants, and he is one of Australia's leading experts on the epidemiology of COVID-19. You've probably seen him on television. He spent the last year and a half, almost 2 years, just becoming a celebrity.
But I don't have a virus named after me.
Probably don't want a virus named after you. It's not as fancy as a meteor. And finally tonight we have Rick Sarre, who's an Emeritus Professor. He retired in April 2020 from the role of Dean at the University of South Australia's Law School and became an adjunct with the UniSA Justice and Society. Before retiring, he had taught commercial law, media law, sports law and criminology for 35 years in 4 countries, the USA, Sweden, Hong Kong and Australia. He is a past president of the Australian and New Zealand Society of Criminology, and in 2017 was awarded fellow status of that society. He's a professorial fellow at the Australian Institute of Police Management and is president of the SA Council for Civil Liberties. So how's retirement treating you, Rick?
Retirement's very busy. I was going to say I've got an office named after me.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
It's got my name on the door still, so it doesn't fly through space and it's a lot closer.
But you can see it.
And I can see it.
You don't have to kind of keep it physically in the back of your brain.
And it's not going to collide with the Earth.
Well, how did we end up here? At the conversation, the big story, obviously, of the last year has been COVID. I was saying to these guys before, so this year, the last 12 months, the conversation had just the Australian and New Zealand team, stories had 220 million reads, and almost all of the top stories that we edited and that were published were about COVID. The exceptions were, the third most read was How Long Does Sex Last? Number 5 was A Giant Piece of Space Junk is Hurtling Towards Earth. And number 7 was Newly Discovered Ghostly Circles in the Sky Can't Be Explained by Current Theories and Astronomers Are Excited. And the 10th most, which I think is probably the most pertinent to me on this list, is why do we wake up around 3 a.m. and dwell on our fears and shortcomings? Obviously, a lot of us have been asking that question. But I wanted to start by asking the panel, what was their big story of 2021? What's the sort of thing that they think is interesting to them and exciting to them from the world? Alice, do you want to start?
Well, in terms of my big story, so given that I work in space, you might predict that they're space-related. And there were 2 for me. One was, I think it's only like about 6 weeks ago, a couple of months ago now, Jeff Bezos launched one of his new suborbital space vehicles designed to take regular people like you or I up into space. And one of the passengers on that was the 80-year-old Wally Funk, who back in the early 1960s wanted to be an astronaut and went into a training program, an independent training program that rivaled the US Mercury astronauts training program, because women were not allowed to be astronauts. And she went through all these tests with 12 other women. They outperformed the men in the tests, which were in fact harder than the ones set for the male astronauts. And then there was a big congressional hearing about whether they should be allowed to go to space. And the answer to that was no. So that was in the early 60s, and this year she got to go to space on one of these Blue Origin vehicles. Mm-hmm. So for me, I guess that was an amazing story for her, but it's also symbolic of the new era of space that's coming up, where space tourism is going to be a big deal, and where women are finally going to get to go to the moon. So for me, for Wally Funk to get to space was kind of the beginning of this whole new era, and I found that really exciting and wonderful.
Yeah.
That was it.
I remember that story, and listening to her sort of talk about it afterwards was really, really affecting.
I found quite an emotional moment.
Yeah. Adrian, what was your big story?
One of the most interesting stories was the astronomers who discovered the furthest planetoid out from the sun, which they called, what was it, far...
I can't remember.
But anyway, it was called Far Out. That was the name of the planetoid, which I thought was very amusing. And it just reminded me of when they asked the general public to name a research vessel, they called it Boaty McBoat. But anyway, that's a bit of a trivia. But look, for me, the most important epidemiological thing that happened during the year was nothing to do with COVID. It was the fact that they rolled out the world's first ever vaccine against malaria in children, which is incredibly important. There are so many kids who die each year, especially young babies. So I think this is just absolutely fantastic.
Great. And Rick, what about for you?
Well, of course, with the whole COVID issue and the prophylactic measures designed to fight it, I'm rather pleased that with colleagues, I got out 3 pieces that had a look to do with the law about mask wearing, a response to the Karens of the world who do certain things in Bunnings, etc., and also vaccines, about whether a vaccine can be mandated, all those sorts of questions, very popular with the reads. And I should add, 3 brilliant colleagues of mine who provide really good information. I just put it together. Sarah Moulds, Joe McIntyre and Juliette McIntyre, who helped me write those 3 pieces, which had enormous readership, I should say, more than 100,000 reads. But I should say that looking back at the analytics, which is a lovely part of the conversation, you can actually see where the interest lies in your work. At the same time as those were getting lots of hits, an article that goes back to 2016 was getting even more hits, notwithstanding it was 5 years old. And that's the one, why does the clitoris get the attention it deserves, or why it doesn't get the attention it deserves, which I should add has made it all the way into this particular book. So it's now had 2 million hits. If you'd like to read it, it's here. But I'm just suggesting that there's a certain element about some of the readership which I think should be more focused on vaccine prophylactics than that particular one.
I was saying to Alice beforehand, and one of the things that Misha, who's editor-in-chief, writes about in the book is how impossible it is to predict what stories will be read. Obviously, COVID was a big one this year, but you get just little things that you work on and you think, this is it, this is the great story, everyone's going to want to read it, and they don't. And then there are pieces which you think, oh yeah, that's all right, that's a fun thing to do, and they just go off. It's a bit unbelievable to sort of watch it in action. But on that note, what was a story from 2021 that you think didn't get the notice that it deserved? Adrian, do you want to start off?
Well, my favourite story, which I wrote, was nothing to do with COVID. You wouldn't believe this, but it was the only one out of 22 which had nothing to do with COVID, and it was a history of clinical trials. Now, I love history, and I love epidemiology, and I love writing. It gave me a chance to do all 3. It only ever had 24,000 hits, but I don't care. And what happened after that was I got contacted by a not-for-profit group in America who write lessons for children's classrooms in America, and they've taken the abridged version up, and it's now used all over America.
Oh, beautiful.
Very nice.
Do you want to give us a little bit of the history of clinical trials? Let us into the story.
It covers everything from TB to all sorts of diseases. It starts off with, well, look, someone didn't wake up one day and say, aha, I know what a phase 3 trial is. I need a control group and I need randomization. These things have been developed over hundreds and hundreds of years, where people have suddenly realised that they must have a control group, otherwise they can't compare anything, and so on. So it's actually a wonderful history, and goes through some of the really weird things, like there was this French physician who, in those days, if someone had a battlefield wound, they put boiling oil on it to cauterize it. Now, this wasn't the best, okay? And he ran out of boiling oil. So he decided to use an ancient recipe which had turpentine in. And the next day, not only were these poor wounded prisoners, wounded soldiers not dead or screaming, they'd actually recovered. And, you know, this is the sorts of stories that you see coming through, which is wonderful.
Yeah.
Boiling oil.
Yeah, the alternative is my most popular one, which was all about false positives in testing. And that had 300,000 reads. Why, I have absolutely no idea.
It's in the news and people are looking at it. But I want to sort of go off what you were saying about the way that the clinical trials have changed and grown. I wonder, Alice, if you can speak briefly on sort of what's sort of something that you've noticed in the space world. You were talking before, obviously, about Bezos and Elon Musk, and sort of what's some like little history in all of that you find really interesting?
Oh, I guess, well, when I think about, because people have probably noticed there's this huge deal being made of these vehicles that we can pay $250,000 to go on this little flight on. And something that a lot of people, I mean, how many people in this room would like to go on a flight into space? Just for, yeah, there's a few of you there. Like, you do need that cool $250,000, so we don't all have that lying around at the back of the couch. But something I think, and you know, relating to what you were saying too, people don't realise is that space makes you feel sick. So when our space billionaires are saying this is going to be available for everybody and soon we'll all be, you know, having our holidays in space, a lot of people just feel horribly sick when they go into space. And our sample size of people to test the causes and possible cures and variations in this, for example, there's approximately 600 people who've been into space, or properly been into space, not just like a suborbital hop. Of those, 11.5% are women. So we know far less about the effects of microgravity or high G-forces or lower G-forces on women's bodies. So we're coming back to Wally Funk, you know, we've been kind of left out of this stuff, and we're going to need some more further medical research to fix this imbalance so that when we, as women people, go into space, we're not facing unknown risks.
Yeah.
So that's just thinking about this in terms of the background to that important story for me.
Can't they just give them travel sickness tablets?
Well, apparently there's a bit of an inverse relationship between motion sickness on Earth and space sickness.
Oh.
So isn't that, you wouldn't expect that, would you?
My favourite fact that I learnt this year about the Bezos and etc. flights is there's a debate about where space starts. And so in countries, just sort of, you know, roughly countries that use kilometres, space starts 100 kilometres above Earth. But in America, they use miles, so it's 50 miles above Earth, which is a bit more, but it's just sort of easier to say 50 miles and 100 kilometres than...
Interestingly, Australia is one of the only nations on Earth which has enshrined a definition of where space begins in legislation.
Oh, wow.
And it is at 100 kilometres, yeah.
Do you know where that came from, that why Australia wanted to enshrine that?
I kind of do, but it's a long story,
Okay.
so I'm not going to bore anyone with that story.
Well, sticking on the history theme, Rick, you were sort of talking about like vaccines and laws around that. How's that shifted? Do you have any idea of the history of medicine and law?
No.
No? Great.
Let me change the subject and say what I thought was going to be a nice little hit along that same theme this last 12 months and what I didn't.
Yes, that was my next question.
There was the inverse reality. I did a piece on spy cameras. During one of the Melbourne lockdowns, they found that a lot of police vans were wandering around with cameras, and obviously there's civil libertarian issues, privacy issues, policing issues, consent issues, and I thought, okay, I'll write a piece on that, just exactly what the privacy concerns were going to be, the power of CCTV, what people's rights were, whether you could hold that data, how long you had to hold the data, all that stuff. May have had 10,000 reads. I thought that was a rather important one. A month later, I wrote one on the future of where I thought Prince Andrew was going to go in relation to his legal case. 200,000 hits. So there's obviously a lot of interest in the royal family.
And
perhaps
what percentage of readers were women?
I don't know. I dare say there's a lot of interest in the royal family generally. I didn't see whether, in fact, they were British readers. There could have been some British readers there. That's one of the nice things, of course, being online. You get to be read all over the world.
Yeah, that's one of the other interesting parts of my job is sort of, looking at reads. Most of our readers are in Australia, but then you get articles that just sort of go off in another country, and you're not always entirely sure where. I think, from memory, I think UniSA has, like, number one country for reads is Australia and number two is France. Just sort of a really little interesting quirk of all of the statistics in that.
Yeah, I think the piece about the clitoris was translated to French. That's true.
Alice, do you have a little story that you can't get out of your head from the last year?
Oh, well, I was just thinking maybe we don't get so many readers from France right now after recent political events. It might be interesting.
Maybe we'll get more
to see how that devolves. No, I guess I can't really think of anything. One of those things that you just sort of sit in the back of your brain and that just pop up every now and then. But I might at this point mention. So my mother is a huge conversation reader.
Lovely.
She lives in country New South Wales, tiny little town. Gets her conversation newsletter in the email every morning, and it's for her. It's a main source of news commentary, I guess. And her internet went down for some reason just a few days ago. And the thing that upset her the most was that she couldn't get into the conversation to see what was happening. So I thought that really, and her connection to me is irrelevant to whether she reads it or not, but I just thought that was, in terms of how people get their news and get the information they need to process and assess the stuff going on, I think it's really interesting to have that demographic.
So here's the strange thing, Jane. Before COVID hit, I'd never even heard of the conversation. And now, of course, it's my daily read. But having said that, I mean, 2 years ago, who'd even heard of an epidemiologist? And now we're media stars, so...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm assuming everyone here knows the conversation, but some people might have come to this through the Hawke Centre. So if you don't, we're a news publication, just turned 10 in March, which is really exciting. But what we do is we only publish academics. And so we get experts in their field to comment. Sometimes quite often it's on the news, it's sort of responsive to things and we're trying to get that expert opinion. But then also sometimes it's just fun pieces of research. One of the series that I work on is called Hidden Women of History. And it's women in history who sort of didn't get their due, sort of you might not know about them, interesting bits of research. And so that's my day job every day, is just getting to work with amazing people like these guys and put their ideas out into the world. I was wondering, does anyone remember the first piece that they wrote for the conversation?
Oh, I do actually.
You don't?
I do, yeah. In 2012, I think it was, and there was a piece of Russian space junk. It was a mission to Mars. It went badly wrong. And the Mars vehicle was going to re-enter the atmosphere, and it was huge. And it actually started on Twitter. A bunch of us were sort of commentating it, I guess. Where is the piece of space junk now? When is it going to come down? What are the impacts going to be? And I started tweeting my top 10 survival hints for space junk landing on your head, hopefully not landing on your head. And somewhere along the line, I kind of remembered somebody had told me about this thing called The Conversation, where academics could work with journalists to get a story out there. And I thought, oh, maybe I'll have a go. I'll tell them about my top 10 hints for dealing with space junk and see what happens. And the editor I spoke to said, yeah, all right, we'll give this a Guernsey. So I wrote it up as an article. The last hint tip I remember was to bring all your kittens inside when the space junk was coming down.
Kittens specifically?
Yes, I did say kittens, and I suppose I meant pets and domestic animals. I don't know why I had kittens in my brain. But yeah, and that experience was sort of, set me off, I guess. It was like, next time I had some kind of idea or reaction to something, I thought, I wonder if the conversation will be interested. Do you guys remember your first ones as well?
Yeah, I remember mine. Obviously, it was about COVID, and I was quite surprised because normally you have to pitch to the editors, and you say, I've got this wonderful story, and would you please look at it and then publish it? But I just got a call from one of the editors out of the blue, and I said I hadn't heard of the conversation. He said, would you write an article for us? And that's how it started, and it got like 40,000 reads, and I could have fallen over backwards. So that's how it all started for me. But I find the conversation, it's a bit like speed dating. So I get a phone call from one of the editors at like 10 in the morning. Adrian, this and this and this has suddenly happened. Could you please write an article? You've got till 4 o'clock this afternoon. And, and you think, I can never do that. It's simply not going to happen. But you do. And it gets published, and it's good fun.
Yeah, great.
You wait till you're retired, Adrian. You've got until 3 o'clock this afternoon. But in fact, I do remember my first one, which goes back to, I think, probably about 2013, and it was on police legitimacy. And from memory, I was asked, sometimes you pitch, sometimes you're asked, and someone said that Paul Dale, who was a Victorian police officer, had run into difficulties. I forget the circumstances, but there was a whole brouhaha about what was happening in policing in Victoria. And I wrote this piece on police legitimacy, and I'd already written 2 or 3 5,000 word articles, which probably had 3 reads. I reduced it to 800 words, which was actually harder to write 800 words than it was to write 5,000 words. And that suddenly got 5,000 hits, which I thought was pretty good then, until I got the Craig McLaughlin story, which had 50,000 hits, and the one about the law of nudity, which had 100,000 hits.
Now, we need to know more about this. What are our legal limits when it comes to nudity?
Well, I did. I read the article. In fact, half the debate of the comments was whether or not Maslins was the first, or whether some New South Wales beach was the first to be declared.
I think we could probably guess where each of those commenters were from as well.
The New South Wales people, after I said Maslins was the first, yes.
Yes.
I have to confess, in my earlier career as a heritage consultant, I had to do a survey for Aboriginal cultural heritage sites on a nudist beach in Sydney. And they were quite perturbed by the appearance of fully field gear, PPE, hats, backpacks, stuff, and they kindly suggested we might have lost our way. And we said, no, we were meant to be here. We were in fact looking for some engravings that were recorded on some flat rock areas on this beach. And they said, why didn't you say? And then we had about 20 naked men all helping us locate this site, which, because they were locals and they knew the area and the intertidal thing really well, they did. So our mission was a success. So,
in fact, Rick and I should write an article together about sex and COVID. That would get millions of reads.
The law of sex and epidemiology, I can see that.
So one of the most read stories that I edited last year was about sex and COVID. I hit the jackpot. It was the title was the best sex you'll never have, and it was about how to do online dating in the age of COVID. So yeah, every now and then you get those little things that cross over. I was saying every day we get our chief of staff, Ali, who edited this book and did a brilliant job. Every day she sends us a list of the top reads for the day, and it's always sort of a game of how can we push these together to make one story. So I think it would be like the law of COVID on the International Space Station, and then we'd have sort of the Uber story there.
I can see some collaboration coming up straight after this.
One thing I will say that people probably don't know is that as academics we write the articles, but we have enormous help from the editors who do a brilliant job. I'm always incredibly impressed at what a good job they do.
Oh, thank you. It's an absolute joy to work with you all. What is that process like, being on the other side of sort of having us tell you what doesn't work and what does work, and sort of seeing all of our editorial process, because everyone just sees the polished end, but sometimes there's a lot of comments that go into it at our end.
I love it, because the thing about the conversation is that if you're writing an article, it has to be evidence-based. You can't simply make a broad statement. And if you forget to say, I got this evidence from X, the editor gets back to you and says, where do you get that from? Give a reference. So, and you know, they'll cut half of your story and do things like that as well, but they always end up being an incredibly good article.
I find something else as well, though. So sometimes, in the course of my sort of academic research, I guess, I've got threads of things that haven't come together yet. And if I were to write it up as a proper academic article, it would be months of work. I would have to, you know, a gazillion footnotes, everything referenced to death. But sometimes what my editors at The Conversation will let me do is take those threads and weave them into a story that is still evidence-based and well argued, but I haven't necessarily gone through that process. And by doing that, I then often that actually helps me develop my thoughts that I then put into the peer-reviewed academic article. So it's kind of like a part, it's become part of the thinking process for me, or a little step in the thinking process. And then, of course, you have the lovely thing that people, well, not always lovely, but people write comments on your articles. And there is, The Conversation has done an amazing job on controlling the trolls.
We try as much as we can, but some do get
some
through.
Through the net. But yeah, having that kind of feedback too, I think is, gives you more things to think about and, more incentive to kind of put your stuff out there too, I guess.
So in case you don't know, people are allowed to comment on The Conversation articles, and most of them are very positive. Occasionally you get someone saying, how do you know that you're in an ivory tower, you know, and you're based in Adelaide, what do you know? Anyway, my daughter taught me never to respond to trolls, so I simply don't respond to them.
I used to ignore responding, but now I respond. Now you're retired, it's a lot easier to respond, particularly when they say you're wrong. Well, that's food. That really gets me riled up. But I should say there was sometimes there's a comment and then you make a comment, there's a comment back. And every now and again, two people in your comments will go at each other for the next 3 days. I wrote a piece, whether it was the one on Justine Damon being killed by the police officer or another piece on firearms generally, and I'm an anti-gun person, so that, of course, gets people riled up reading in the United States, or in fact not riled up. And at one point I wrote a piece, and I think there was something like 300 back and forth between these three people about whether or not guns actually should be made more available, and I just watched it and stayed right out of it. So actually, if you look at the analytics on my websites of myself, there's more than 3,000 comments.
Wow.
But most of those are about guns.
There are some days where you see that fight happening and you just, I don't have the energy to spend the next 3 days moderating this. I'm just going to close the comments and just like a little burst of power. We did get a complaint email recently that closing the comments after 3 days wasn't fair, and I think if you just move your fight to another article, guys, there'll be something else that you'll be disagreeing with soon enough. If anyone hasn't seen it, this is the year, every year we come out with a book which are the best articles of The Conversation for the year, and this year it's the best 50 stories. Well, you know, there might be a bit of a debate on if they are the best 50 stories from The Conversation for the last 10 years, both from the Australian desk and from our international editors. And I wondered if maybe the panel would talk about some things in here that they really liked. Adrian?
Well, my favourite story in there is about Chernobyl. So, you know, their reactor 4 meltdown, and the whole of that area, which was mainly pine forest, turned into a wasteland. And everyone thought it'd be a desert there for the next 5,000 years. It turns out that the pine forest is regrown. It's absolutely full of wildlife. It's got bears and all sorts of things there. And even some of the animals have adapted to it. So the frogs apparently are darker inside the area than outside because the dark skin protects them from radiation. And I think reading it, I just thought, well, here's nature at its best. You can whack it as much as you want, it can come back. And it does give us some hope for climate change.
That's such a positive thought to take out of Chernobyl.
There are sort of, sometimes it's one of my favourite pieces was about the benefits of sadness. It's just sort of finding those little light moments in darker stories can be really beautiful.
Yeah, Norman Swan in his new book wrote about that. He said, it's no good feeling crap all the time. You don't want to do that. This is Norman Swan, he speaks like that. There's no point feeling crap all the time. He said neither it's any good feeling good all the time. You needed some sort of shading, you need some balance, which I thought was reasonable and very similar to what the article said in the book. But then I thought, well, what about Rasputin? The mad monk. And, Rasputin apparently had such a strong sex drive that when he was near cows, they gave out more milk. But Rasputin believed that you really had to know what debauchery was in order to know what good was. And so he indulged all the time in debauchery. So I think everything has to be in moderation.
I'm glad you clarified that. Adrian, actually, when you said the mad monk, I thought it was Tony Abbott. So, well, maybe I can go to answer your question next.
Sure.
The article I enjoyed the most is actually the one from which the title is taken, No, You're Not Entitled to Your Opinion, which is a terrific little piece. I should say that I wrote a similar one back in 2016, which wasn't selected.
I said there would be debate about whether they were the 50 articles.
It obviously got on the cutting room floor. It probably was the next one to be included in the second volume. But this is a very, very, very good piece because, in fact, it does highlight, particularly in this age of the so-called postmodern age, where everyone believes that they're sovereign citizens, they can be anti-vaxxers, every voice is valid, let 1,000 flowers bloom, let's all just tell each other what we think. And of course this piece is saying, well actually yes, but no, not if it's completely illogical and idiotic. You don't have a right to say that, particularly when there are other people who might be influenced by what you're saying. So we're getting to that stage now. We've got philosophers out there, I'm sure, that we're talking about the so-called postmodern might have kind of died. We're sort of moving towards a postmodern, which has got this piece of saying now that we actually do have lots of people who've done the research. We've had 20 or 30 or 40 years, particularly in the law and criminology, where we have this vast array of material now. The research has just completely burgeoned. And people are still relying upon anecdotes from the 1960s, the 1970s. As they say, the plural of anecdote is no data. So that's why I like that piece.
Jane, if I could just mention my second favourite article.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
And it was all about Donald Trump. We had to read something about Donald Trump. And what it said was, many people in America and elsewhere, and this was written in 2016, by the way, he said, many people in America and elsewhere are scared of what Donald Trump will do, and quite rightly so, as we know. It says, we've all looked on with astonishment, fear, and even amusement at how Donald Trump has dominated politics in America. And what the book said was, we know politicians sometimes lie. Indeed, we know that political life would be impossible were that not so. But I do not remember anyone in mainstream democratic politics who lied so shamelessly, so often, and so fast that the fact checkers could not keep up with them. Which I thought was a wonderful piece of prose. And, we might laugh at that, but we do see shades of it in Australian politics. And, we don't have anyone who lies, do we?
I think the text messages, wasn't that, they sort of said there wasn't lying? Is that where we're at the moment with that?
Well, shall I talk about my...
Yeah, please.
So, there's so much in there and things to appeal to everyone. So the articles that I love the most in the book is one by Leah Rupana and Brendan Clark, which is about how even in that article was 2019, even in 2019, men aren't doing enough housework, are not pulling their weight in the field of unpaid domestic labour. And I thought they made the case very well. And I firmly believe men need to do more housework. So I'll put that out there. There was another lovely article by Kenneth Brophy, which was about the end of a friendship, a very old friendship, reflecting on the particular path this friendship took, and it was just so beautifully written and, made me think about a lot of things. I'm sure it made you think about a lot of things. I think your reaction to it probably, what am I trying to say? Everybody probably has their own kind of reaction to it based on their experience, but it was just such a lovely way to express.
I initially gave that one to my wife who was grieving from a broken friendship, and it really helped her,
So that's definitely one to read in this book. There's also one I didn't like. Am I allowed to?
Yes, please, go. I think that, you're just bringing the comments to real life. Let's go for it.
So there's one on how long sex lasts.
How long should sex last?
How long should sex last, which I found very, I'm sure there's a word for this, very penis-centric. And I didn't finish reading it because I disagreed. So that's exactly the kind of thing the book is trying to...
I'll call it phallometric.
Phallometric. That's a word I've not heard
That's the word you wanted, I think.
Phallometric.
Isn't that how long it is?
Yeah. Well, how long does sex last? I would have thought long.
So, but I think this is it coming back to, you're not entitled to your opinion. So we don't have to like everything.
No.
But articles that make us have a reaction and make us think, it's definitely, in my opinion, always been one of the strengths of the conversation.
Can I come back to housework just for a second, since Alice raised it? You'll have more information when the census is revealed from this year, which will be in the next year or so, because there was a question there about to all participants about how long you spend doing the housework. I'm sure there were some marriages, not unlike mine, where there was some eye-rolling going on with what I predicted I was doing and what my good wife actually thought was accurate. So I don't know whether others... There's a lot of nodding going out there, but you'll know exactly where that is, where the perception is. Perhaps you should have had two questions there in the census. What do you think you do, and what does your spouse think you do? And then we would have had a bit more metrics in relation to that.
I hate to say it, but studies show that,
give me the evidence.
That men consistently underreport the amount that they do. So I think it will be an interesting measure of perception. Exactly.
Males underreport or overreport?
Yeah, that one.
I think you'll find the census will bear that out.
Actually, one of the other stories I really enjoyed was a sort of boy's own story, which was if you had an inland taipan from Australia fight a black mamba from Africa, which would win? And I love these stories.
They're one of my favourite series that we do.
And both of them got some of the most highly toxic venom in the world. And the author, who was an expert, turned out and said, well, whichever snake is bigger would probably win. And the fact is that reason why snakes are very nervous of us is because we're much bigger than them. So having read that article, I immediately looked up who would win out of a hippo and a croc, which is what you do with Google. In Google, you might look up an actor, and it turns out it says, do you mean this actor or do you mean this serial killer? And then you go after the serial killer 2 hours later, you're still looking at things. But anyway, so I did look up a hippo and a croc, and apparently no self-respecting croc would go near a hippo because it'd easily beat it.
Oh.
A hippo is the most dangerous animal in Africa. But there you are, but it makes you think.
Talking about what people liked, this is the top 10 stories from UniSA authors in the last 12 months at the conversation. Why are some COVID test results false positives? What we know about South Australia's COVID outbreak. Then, did we used to have 2 sleeps rather than 1? What we should drink with dinner to get the most iron and what we should avoid. 4 things about female orgasms. The PR disaster around Prince Andrew. COVID vaccine. Solar panels. Do you answer emails outside of work hours? Do you send them? New research shows how dangerous this can be. I think at work we were all very happy when that was published. It sort of gave us the excuse to not do any outside of work emails. And a piece about Myanmar. So it's an interesting mix of stories there. Does anyone have any ideas they take away from what that says about us?
I think typically, if you look not just at last year, but over the last 5-6 years, you'll see there's a great deal of interest in the human form, things like sleep, body mass, sex, the sorts of things we don't normally would be asking our GP, and don't go to Dr. Google, just finding an expert say something on how much fitness you should have, how much iron you should have, how much sex you should have. That's in there, isn't there, I think? As a way of just simply answering a very simple question that most people do not have accurate information about, and there it is in 800 words from an expert. And I think that's one of the reasons that has become one of the more typically, or those topics are more typically the highest ones, particularly obviously in the last 12 months too, about not only epidemiology and vaccines, but the rights associated with not having a vaccine and not having to wear a mask. The sorts of immediate questions that are on people's lips, and you can go to 1 million websites to find out, but you want someone who's actually gone through those websites, sifted the wheat from the chaff, and that's one of the great values of the conversation, that it basically does distill the best material that's there on the web, and typically all the links are web-based, and just says exactly what you need to know. And that's one of the things that I find, as I'm about to go on the radio and answer a particular question, I find the conversation a very useful tool in that regard.
That's true. And I think actually your point about accurate and accessible information about immediate things, about decisions we make about our bodies, because I know some of the all-time top-read articles from Flinders University have been about sugar, like how much sugar should we eat, if sugar, I've read them, if we shouldn't eat sugar, then why is the sugar in fruit okay, things like that. So I think there's definitely something in this idea that people are looking for information about their physical being in the world.
I mean, the trouble with diet is, of course, ideas keep changing. 1 minute it should be on high carbs, next minute on low carbs, you know. And I suppose it keeps people in a job writing articles for the conversation about the latest fad diet.
We're talking about, Flinders. The Flinders is, it's a bit more of an eclectic bunch, the last 10 for the last year, which is interesting as well, just sort of what comes out of the different universities. So the number 1 was worried about the Earth's future. Well, the outlook is worse than even scientists can grasp. So it's a cheery read for you all. Is watching porn bad for your health? This was my favourite headline of the year. I asked historians what made them go, wait, what? Here's a taste of the hundreds of replies. There was one about superhighways for Indigenous people, the discovery of Antarctica and how as soon as humans went there, they started killing animals, renewable energy in South Australia, undersea middens, the discovery of a lost city in ancient Egypt, a piece by Alice about the life and death of the first space chimp. And as I just said, if sugar is so bad for us, why is the sugar in fruit okay? It's a very eclectic bunch of topics.
I think you do see, though, because Flinders has an archaeology department. Some of my wonderful archaeology colleagues are here tonight. So you can see and now I do space archaeology, but some of those stories are very definitely related to our particular expertise in that area, which is great to see.
Well, I feel like I've brought up a lot tonight, and these guys have been really great about talking about how great the conversation is, and I definitely love my job. But I'm interested in what you guys love about your job, not necessarily to do with the conversation, but what is it about the work that you do that you find exciting and rewarding?
Do you want me to go first?
Yes.
I love it because as a doctor, you're helping individual patients. As an epidemiologist, you're helping whole populations. You know, and this little me can help lots and lots of people, and I just find that wonderful.
What about on the day-to-day basis, sort of the nitty-gritty of the work? Is there something that you like about the process?
I always wanted to be an actor, and you know, and unfortunately, I never got to be one. I did lots of amateur acting, but never a professional one. And these days, all this media stuff allows me to give vent to all that. So just being here tonight is me with my acting hat on. So yes, I love that.
Great. Rick?
I wanted to be an actor as well. But my career was tragically cut short by a lack of talent. In fact, I've often said, or people have said, that the UniSA Law School, which is just over there, is beautifully positioned right between the Remand Centre and the Playhouse. So there are a lot of lawyers who'd like to be actors. What do I enjoy about my job? Look, I do think that I've been around a long time answering particularly civil libertarian type questions. A lot of people feel powerless when they're confronted by someone who waves some law at them, or a sovereign citizen says the Constitution does this, or someone will say the Privacy Act doesn't allow you to do that. One of the nice things about being an academic is you've had those tutorials 400 times. You do know what you're talking about. The students give you the feedback, the students ask the questions, you respond to that. Eventually you've got a database in your brain about most things to do with the law, particularly civil libertarian questions. So the nice thing is that when an academic like myself gets asked a question on the phone, on the radio, in the conversation, I can respond in a way that gives people some power back into their hands, not to be intimidated by someone who's got some half-baked idea that they're going to be thrusting into their arms. So I do love my job in that sense, that a lot of people say, I just don't know where to turn now, and a lawyer can just give that particular person some strength, some information, some knowledge, some other people to connect with, and there's something gratifying about that. And in fact, people have heard me say this before, one of the unusual things about being an academic is you don't get into practice when you actually can make a person's life, that particular individual you're acting for, quite different. And when you're in practice, you say, I'm tired of looking after these particular individuals. I want to talk to a whole lecture full of people. So that's why a lot of practitioners want to be academics, a lot of academics want to be practitioners. If we can find out a way of making that a reality, there'd be a lot of happy people.
How about you, Alice?
Well, I think what both Rick and Adrian have said is kind of about making a difference in the world, whether that's difference for one person or difference for a class of people or a group of people. So when I think about what that means for me, my day-to-day job as an academic supports my ability to think about and write about and research particular areas, which has kind of led me, an archaeologist, to be in a position where I can have an opinion about how humans are going to use space in the future, and people listen, not all the time, but I feel that one of the most enjoyable and important things I can do from this situation is to make a difference about humanity not destroying space as we've destroyed the Earth, and that's something I'm working on at the moment across a number of different fronts. So that kind of justifies the whole process of doing research and being an academic, and at the end of the day making a difference at some level to people's lives. So that's, yeah. That's
the other thing I found
about
is that, you know, over the last couple of years, I've had lots of contact with the general public. And the vast majority of people I've spoken to or tweeted with say they are sick to the teeth of politicians. They want straight answers, they simply don't get them. And I think that ability to be able to communicate with the general public, just to everybody here, and try and explain complex things quite simply to them, I think it's really a fantastic thing to do, and I really enjoy it.
Jane, can I say something else about law students?
Yes.
Very, very briefly.
Not rude, I hope.
And that is to go back 20 years when I was first teaching in the law programs here. And there was a definite feel that most people going into the law because they wanted to make money. It was a great profession. There was a guaranteed income. There were a lot of spaces for lawyers, and lawyers were going to be doing very well, thank you very much, in professional ranks. The last 5, 6, 7 years, talking to the academics as well as myself, and the students who are coming into the law schools, and you ask and quiz them why they're there, they say, I want to make a difference, whether it's environmental, whether it's human rights, whether it's because the politicians are letting us down, whether it's the fact that people don't, whether it's an Indigenous issue. There would not be too many law students who are going to law schools now who have the first thought of actually having a great professional income. I'm enormously gratified by the students that I speak to who do genuinely say they actually want to help out and make a difference in society. And that's quite a revolution. I very much enjoyed watching that. I don't know what happened, whether it's just this generational thing, whatever it is, generation, whoever they are now, the kids born in the 1990s, whatever they're called.
Gen Z.
The Gen Zs. I really think the Gen Zs, particularly when you see the Green Revolution, the Black Lives Matter, the people who are out there doing those issues, the net zero by 2030, the Extinction Rebellion, the XRs, all those people tend to be 25 years old. It's an amazing revolution, and it's very, very heartening.
Yeah, I wonder if they're seeing the same thing in medicine.
I don't know. Read the conversation.
Well, Adrian, you were saying as well that there's public health is a field that people are sort of really, young people are turning to and are interested in now.
Yeah, apparently we've got record numbers of people applying to do public health at UniSA. So I think it's really brought this idea of the public good and helping the public in general is really taken root with this pandemic. So, I mean, there's not many silver linings coming out of it, but that's one of them.
Alice, what are you noticing in your students?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one because, well, archaeology students typically end up working in heritage management, and we're very happy that so many of our graduates are now the ones that are involved in environmental impact studies. They're out there working with mining companies trying to get better outcomes for traditional owners and Indigenous communities. And I guess I don't think the pandemic has changed that at all. I think that commitment and interest has been fairly consistent. I suppose if anything, and maybe my colleagues would agree with me, and I think our students have become much more politically critical and savvy at some levels. And that's a really good thing because it means, they will be prepared to get out there and fight some of those battles and, not just be thinking about, similar actually. So there used to be, people might not know this. People often assume that if you're an archaeologist, you can't get a job. But in fact, archaeologists work in heritage management in Australia and it's quite easy to get employed. But that commitment to better social justice outcomes through heritage, I think rather than a concern for earning the big consulting bucks, is something we definitely see in our students and probably has strengthened over the last decade as well. So I think it's nice to sort of be getting to this place in this conversation where we're having positive thoughts for how the future is going to play out with the students that we all engage with and teach.
Well, thinking about the future, we're almost at the end of 2021, end of tonight. But looking forward to 2022, what are the stories that you think we should be keeping our eyes out for? What's going to happen? Of course, acknowledging in 2019, none of us knew what was happening, but what do you think is coming up for us?
Well, I've got two. The first is that next year, India will take over China as having the world's biggest population. And I think that's got huge implications for global politics and for trade. The second thing I think is an interesting story is that I don't know whether you've all heard of Nostradamus, who was this sort of 16th century French philosopher and psychic.
And bad poet, can I just say?
He wrote these quatrains which have been interpreted, and he actually got a lot of things right at the Second World War, for example, which is not bad for a 16th century philosopher. But apparently, I've just read this, he reckons that, or at least his quatrain reckons that in the next few months, so we're talking about next year now, there's going to be another pandemic, presumably put out by the Russians, so what I've read, and it's going to cause people to be half dead. Now, you might laugh.
Zombie apocalypse.
You might laugh, but CDC have now put out a formal piece of work for the general public explaining to them how they must prepare for the zombie apocalypse. You can Google it if you don't believe me.
Oh my gosh.
A question that I'm always interested in knowing, are you interested in surviving the zombie apocalypse? Because I just don't really see the other side being that great.
I'm a real survivor, yes.
Well, I think there are two stories that will dominate. Obviously, next year we have two elections, a fixed-term election for the state in March, and somewhere between now and or the beginning of the year and May will be a federal election. And I think that will dominate us in terms of where our leadership's going to go. And one of the things we'll find is the rise of the independent. I've got a feeling that in both those elections we're going to have either a minority government or a hung parliament or something, because there will be so many more people who will be elected because of that essential loss of trust now in the major parties. And that'll be a very interesting debate for us to see how our parliaments will be operating, where there's no clear winner and there's all these negotiations through people who are going to be independently elected. So that's my first prediction. The other prediction is that I don't think the Queen is going to survive next year. That will raise, with all due respect to her, she looks pretty good at the moment, but she's getting up there in years. And that, of course, will raise that next question about whether, in fact, we go down the Republic road, because who knows what Prince Charles wants to do, whether he wants to do that or just flick it straight to the next guy. Won't be Prince Andrew. I think he's a bit further down.
You can actually bet on it. You can bet on whether the Queen will die next year.
I'm sure you can.
I'm sure Sportsbet has
flies
that up.
climbing up the wall. So I think the Republic issue obviously will be raised again. It seems to have gone off the boil, although it does appear to be part of the Labor platform at the moment. But that will still keep bubbling away. So I think that'll be the two issues very early in the year. Plus, of course, just whether or not we can meet these targets we've set as a result of COP26, which I don't think we can. And of course, the rise of India and their needs and burning our coal and their own coal is going to be horrific somewhat in relation to those targets and the emissions that will continue to rise. So, and again, the Extinction Rebellion will just keep on keeping on. So we'll have all those issues, plus the pandemic, plus the fires that are inevitable. It sounds like a rather bad...
You're a miserable thing, you.
Oh, we'll all love each other, though, I suppose.
Well, I want to inject something positive into my predictions for next year. So something I'm really looking forward to is Australian rocket company Gilmore Space are going to be launching not one but two completely Australian designed and made rockets on an Australian launch site up in Queensland. And they are going to name their missions after consultation with the Juru traditional owners of that area. And this will be the first time that Australia has launched something on its own rocket since the early 60s.
Wow.
So I think this is a fairly significant milestone. And for me is, will be, you just wait, it's going to happen. This will be like a symbol and a signal for Australia taking back the lead in space. And because we're reinventing I don't need to tell anyone in this room, anyone from South Australia knows how deep our space heritage is. In case you don't, Woomera is what I'm getting at here. And it would just be really nice. We're rebuilding ourselves at the moment, and I think we can do it in a better way. We can demonstrate to the world how you do properly sustainable consultative space. And so I'm kind of excited to see how we're going to do all of these things coming up in the next few years.
Great.
Now, Jane, I'm going to go out on a limb here, getting my crystal ball out. I am forecasting that Adelaide Crows will get into the finals.
That's what I call a real limb. That's a
phantom one.
That's a very long limb, I would have thought. I'd put my money on the Queen's demise before that.
Well, thank you all for joining me tonight, and thank you everyone for coming. It's been a real pleasure. Could you help me in thank our beautiful panel?
Thank you.